Hi guys, how are you? Welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. Today I have a guest with me and I'm really excited to have this guest. I've been on her podcast and she's going to tell you a little bit about who she is. But I think for me, one of the most important things with this podcast is hearing a variety of stories, of life experiences, and really understanding the different ways in which we're all coming at topics like estrangement, generational trauma, cycle breaking. So, my guest today is Rachel Varkey. Hi, welcome.
Hi, Harriet. I'm so excited to be on the podcast and chat with you. We learned so much on our podcast episode together about, cycle breaking, estrangement, all these things that I think many of my listeners are a little shy of, afraid of. Most of us coming from like child of immigrant background. So it was really cool to talk to you about that and give some folks some narratives, some voice, some ways to talk about some of the challenges that they're facing every day.
Yeah, and I loved being on your podcast. I loved our conversation. I feel like it was really impactful and really deep. So, tell me a little bit about what you are going to be talking about today, a little bit about yourself and who you are.
Yeah, for sure. So, as Harriet mentioned, my name is Rachel Varkey. I am the creator of the It's Fine podcast. And I created this podcast because I would notice amongst girlfriends, like we would say these heart wrenching, these difficult things, anything from like family drama to like, relationships with our spouses to not feeling authentically ourselves. And then at the end of that, 3 minute, 10-minute saga, we'd be like, well, it's fine. It's whatever. Right. Like the
So
very
true.
classic, very female way of navigating our challenges, right? Is that like, it's fine. We'll get over it. We'll keep pushing through. And one day I really sat with myself and was like, why? Why am I saying it's fine to these things that actually are deeply impacting my life and how I want to authentically live? Really, what it comes down to with my podcast is that I am really challenging myself first, but also the people who listen to really think about why do we say it's fine to things that are not really fine? And how can we find the tools, the resources, oftentimes just like the language to talk about things that we know we need to tackle and face head on, right? And I think with Harriet, we talked a bit about what it looks like to really tackle cycle breaking and the idea that we want our lives to look different than the lives that we lived from our childhood experiences. But how do we do that? What does it look like? What does it look like to potentially be estranged from family members who are not aligned to that cycle breaker mentality? Right. And who
Yeah.
are the people? We talked a little bit. I think the thing that was most poignant about my conversation with Harriet was we talked about rupture and repair, which I thought was such a powerful way of helping for someone like myself who was a child of immigrants. One of the challenges that I have personally experienced in navigating family trauma and generational trauma is this sense that I owe my family who has sacrificed so much for me, who has done
Mm.
everything from, coming to a foreign country, figuring out who they are, putting food on the table, providing literally my mom will proudly say that she wears t-shirts with holes in them because she literally won't buy herself new things
Yeah.
because she wants her kids to have the best, right? And sometimes that can really be used against children of immigrants, right? Like
Mhm.
we stay stuck in these patterns because we're afraid to really challenge our parents who have done so much, right? And so that is such a complicated story. And I think what Harry and I really talk about, and what I'd love to talk about today, right, is how does a child of immigrants, how does somebody who comes from a family who might have come to a more Western culture or society or whatever, how do you balance potentially exploring what it looks like to be a cycle breaker?
I think that's such an important thing, and why I'm so excited to talk to you today. Because one of the things that I have had said to me several times now, naturally on TikTok, because TikTok is just the most feral place when it wants to be. But something that I have had said to me on quite a few occasions is, oh, well, this is such a white woman thing. And I'm like, one, rude. Two, immediately know and how dismissive of the experiences of people of color to refer to it as such.
For sure.
Estrangement and toxic family dynamics is something that transcends all types of cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. It's such a huge thing, but it affects us in different ways, and we react to it in different ways because of our culture, because of the way that we are raised, because of the cycles that we're in. And I think that's really important to be able to shed light on what you've been talking about. and how that's impacted you and what that looks like for your dynamic and your lived experience. So tell us a little bit about your background and your experience of growing up as a child of immigrants.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, I want to address that this is a white woman thing
Yeah.
comment. So I would say that personally may have believed that at one
Mm,
point or another, right? Because when you grow up a certain way, right? Especially for children of immigrants, I come from an honor shame background. I am
yeah.
Indian American. And so when you grow up this way, it is so hard to imagine a world where there are boundaries, where your parents respect you, where there isn't like an age mentality, right? Like just because you're older than me, then you know better than me. There's so many things that just feel so foreign. And then you see for myself, my American friends and like their dynamics with their parents and being like, what is this? This is so unrelatable, you
Yeah.
know? But my personal experience, so I grew up in America. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. My parents immigrated, my mother in the early 90s, my father in the late 80s. And I was actually born in the US. And so my parents moved to a place that was predominantly American, predominantly white. And they had a very small Indian community that they became a part of, right? And that's pretty true for a lot of different children of immigrants, regardless of where you come from, right? Like we often find like these pockets of where our families are, our families, people that are similar to us, right? And we kind of navigate and kind of, cluster together. And
Yeah.
that was my personal experience. And part of my own experience as well is that my family is also Christian. And so they created this Indian church that they were a part of. And my life really revolved around being a part of this community, right? So sometimes 3-4 days a week, I was interacting with this Indian community, right? I would be one person, when I went to school and was a part of a more like, let's just call it Western, right? This is just like, the everyday going to school, coming back, all of that. That was not Indian, right? Because it was
Hmm.
like a Western American school. And then coming home and having really strict like Indian values, a lot of patriarchal values, a lot of Christian, which like when I like look back at my life now, I realize like a lot of it wasn't necessarily that I was super Indian. A lot of it was like the religious norms and expectations of my culture enmeshed with my Indian culture. And it was just like a double whammy of like, patriarchy, Indian culture, patriarchy, Christian culture, just like mush it together. And it was how do you navigate through that? And
Yeah.
so for me, I grew up always really wanting to be free. I think I
Hmm.
always felt this need to be free, to express myself, to be able to share my story, to be authentic, to use my voice. I've always felt really strongly about that, but didn't always come from a place where that voice was acknowledged, praised, admired, right? Like that wasn't considered something to be proud of, to have a voice like that. And I think when I look at my life and I think about, the parts of me that I am afraid of, right, is when I raise my voice, when I use my voice, when I step out, right? Like that in that there's this always this part of me that's like, what happens if I do that? Like what will be the consequences of doing that thing? But so I spent most of my life in Seattle. I moved to New York when I was in my early 20s and I got married when I was in New York. And I started to notice that a lot of these beliefs that I had about my life that really came from my culture, my religious upbringing, started to really infiltrate into my marriage. I started to see that like I had really bad coping mechanisms. It was really easy for me to get angry with my partner and not be able to express myself. I was not very emotionally regulated. And I started going to therapy. And when I went to therapy, I had a white older woman therapist.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I started that process and I was like, oh, she's not going to get me. But the reality is like this question about boundaries and how do you, navigate the relationship with your parents and some of the things that just happened that were just dead wrong, right? Like,
Yeah.
regardless of like how much sacrifice, how much they did for you, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're Indian or a different culture or white, right? Some of that shit, it just isn't great. And my
Mm,
therapist really helped me kind of open my eyes to see that like life doesn't necessarily have to be black and white. There's actually quite a bit of gray. And the thing that I learned the most in that moment, and I think that I carry with me as a cycle breaker, is this idea that my parents can be really good. My parents can be really good people. They can love me. They could have sacrificed. They could have done the best that they could with the resources that they had. And they also could have harmed me. That
yeah.
is the most important thing that I have learned in my life, in that period of my life. And I think a lot of times when I talk to other children of immigrants, especially people who are earlier on in the journey, it's really easy to be like, well, that's just white people shit. That's like white women shit. Like,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we dismiss, it's fine, these things that happen in our lives, and we then see how they make us smaller and take less space in our adult lives, right? Think about relationships with family, right? Sometimes we allow our parents to tell us how we raise our children, how we show up in certain spaces, right? Because they sacrificed, they did the best for us, they know better than us because they're older than us, or whatever your reasoning is, right? But the reality is that they are human and they don't always know what's right for us. And I think sometimes we can really get entrenched in this thinking, and really being able to step back and say, these things that happened to me were harmful. And there were really good things that my parents did for me. And I am not estranged with my parents. I actually am a person who truly is trying to figure out what it looks like to have a relationship with my parents while acknowledging these pieces. And so, what that looks like for me is literally physical distance, because
Yes, yeah.
I don't know how to navigate the relationship yet. And I still am figuring that out. I think as I become more confident in my cycle breaker traits or, skills, right, I'm navigating that more effectively. But I find if I spend too much time close to my parents, I start like reverting back to this old version of myself that I really don't want to be.
Yeah, and I think that's something that so many people will relate to, is reverting back to that old version of a person that you don't relate to anymore, that you don't want to be, that you find difficult. And that in itself is really telling of how much work we have done, how much work we've put into becoming our own person. I think in a lot of people's experiences, there is this real kind of enmeshment that you talked about before, where you are looking to the family to tell you what you should be doing, or how you should be acting, how you should take up space within this space, who you should be. And when you go out and you find your own path and you find out who you want to be and who you truly are and your authentic self, when you go back into that relationship, it's really difficult not to lose that, especially when that conflicts with what your parents' idea of who you should be and your authentic self. That's really tricky.
Yeah, I will say, so I just had my first child in January, sorry, in late December. My due date was January. And my mother came and stayed with us for a month, which was really helpful. And I want to like shout out like a lot of think children of immigrants, and like, this not necessarily, this might be true for other folks too, but I was super grateful to have my mother with me, because that is a very like tender and fragile time. It really helped me kind of recoup, physically heal, help with, sleep deprivation, all of that, right? But towards the end of her stay, I started to notice myself getting like a little anxious, because I started to see myself becoming, almost reverting back into like some of the anxiety that she carries within herself that she hasn't really been able to walk through, right? And kind of placing that on me. And one like funny example of this is that, so I had a longer maternity leave, and my husband is working. He started working basically right after my son was born, and he did a lot of chores in our household. And I remember very candidly, like very vividly, that my mom would be so open and frustrated with us, like because we never noticed anything that was like wrong in the home. Like we never noticed the laundry piling up. We never noticed the dust. Like she was like, am I the only person who has eyes in this house? Right. And I catch myself now being like, oh my God, I'm turning into my mother, because like I see that now. I see that I'm the only person, and that what that is mental load. Let's just call it what it is. Right.
Yes. Oh, yes.
But my mom noticed that my husband, who typically does the laundry, wasn't able to do it as like quickly as I did. And like my mom is the type of person, like some of the things that I carry from like my parents is that this need to get everything done right away, like burn yourself into the ground, get everything done right away. Like everything should be done on your to-do list. But they have no capacity for rest. Like they do not know how to rest at all.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so my mom noticed that the laundry hadn't been done. And so she was like, oh, Rachel, please, like, do the laundry, do the laundry. You have to do the laundry. And I was like, I mean, Charles does the laundry, right? And like, we had this back and forth. And like, truly, I needed to step in and do the laundry, because like, I was getting to a point where like I had like bikini bottoms for underwear. Like that was like where we were at. It was detrimental. And so I did the laundry and it took me forever. And when I did it, I remember my mom, she was like, "Oh, I'm so proud of you. Oh my goodness." And like she said all this stuff, but I felt myself like wanting to cry because
Mm.
what it felt for me, like, my mom is like proud of me, whatever. But what it actually felt like for me is, am I becoming her? Am I going to be like so angry at everyone in the world? Am I always going to be bitter about like the fact that I do everything and like my partner does nothing, right? Like, especially when it comes to like household management and things like that. And like, I realized that like being around her for that long, like I almost was started getting trapped in this sense of thinking, right? Like, oh, well, maybe she is right. Like maybe I need to do more. Like maybe I need to do the laundry. Maybe I don't need to rest. Like maybe I don't need to have grace for myself, right? Because you sort of take on the personality and like the values and the traits of the company you keep, right? And so I really have to be mindful of when is that thinking kind of creeping into my life. And I think it's really fair to say like it doesn't you don't necessarily it probably isn't your fault if you are struggling to step out or break out from some of these like toxic cycles or toxic patterns of your family if you're like deeply invested and surrounded by people who carry those values, right? I think that the most important thing you can do is find whether that be community in like the place that you are and you because you need to stay close to your family, or like taking that leap of faith and maybe like leaving and seeing like who you can be outside of that.
Do you think that that was a really pivotal moment for you when you actually left and you managed to pull away from that and you could perhaps see some of your family's generational trauma beforehand? Could you see it? Or was the enmeshment so deep? I mean, for me, until I really got distance from my mum and until I ended up cutting contact, I felt like it was a slow trickle of recognizing
Mhm.
things after I had children, of going, that's not normal. Oh, I would never do that to my children. That's not okay. And then it built and built to the point where we ended up cutting contact. And actually, when we'd cut contact and I could pull away completely, that was when I really started to reflect on how many things had been toxic, when so many memories started flooding back. And I'm wondering if for you, that distance was when you really started to notice the generational trauma within your family, or if it was more something that you'd always kind of been aware of, having grown up with the American side of things and the Indian side of things.
Yeah, I would say it's a mix of both. So growing up, I didn't have the words for it, but I didn't feel comfortable. And
Yeah.
that I think I was always really aware of. I used words like, I feel different. I don't feel like I belong here. Or, I want to get out. I wanted to run away. Like I always felt that way from like a really young age that like where I was wasn't like the right environment for me. Right. But I didn't really know why. And I didn't have the
Yeah.
words to describe that. Right. And so when I was, at the age of going to college, I really wanted to leave home. I wasn't able to do that. I left the home, but I stayed within like the Seattle area when I went to college. But even that alone exposed me to different kinds of people. And I think one of the really interesting things in my own experience is that I've always been very close to people of different ethnicity groups, but don't are not necessarily Indian as well, right? So like I would have like Cambodian friends, Chinese friends, Vietnamese friends, Spanish friends, like folks who have almost like similar qualities of growing up, similar values, but like don't necessarily have the exact same life circumstances as me. But then I started to see like, oh, this is not just like a me, myself, like my family dynamic. This is like common themes and trends that like lots of young people are experiencing, especially children of immigrants, right? And the further I got away from them, the more maybe awareness I got. When I actually was able to put the words to it though was when I got married, because I married an Indian person. I married a Malayali guy, so from the same
Okay.
community that I grew up in, right? Or grew up around. My Malayali husband has had such a different point of view, and I think like I started to see like how my trauma, right? The things that I didn't know how to manage, my lack of emotional regulation, my anxiety, my inability to express anger, my stonewalling, right? Like these things that just naturally
Mm.
come up like when you're in a relationship and like you have to be with someone all the time 24/7, right? Like it's all fun and games until like you start having disagreements, right?
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
but like I started to see that like my wounding was hurting him and I didn't want to wound him. I didn't and I the biggest fight that we had, and that was like my turning point, was that we got into a fight about something really dumb. I think it was like he didn't take out the trash or something really dumb. But I got so angry with him that I physically just left our apartment and like walked away for like 2 or 3 hours because I just didn't know how to fight fair in that space. And he was so upset with me for just like getting up and leaving. Right. And for me, that was normal. I had been stonewalled my whole life. I got silent treatment all the time. Like it was very normal to like experience that and then just like get over it. Right. Like that was
Yes.
just like
Yeah. No
how we
communication about it. Just this happened. We fell out. I've not spoken to you for a few days, but now, hey, we're back. Okay.
exactly like we no sorry, no acknowledgement of what's going
Mm,
on, right? But I saw how much that was wounding him and I was like, I don't want to live in a world where like I'm just wounding the person I love the most, and I don't want to build a family where like these are just the values that I'm perpetuating, right? And I think by doing that and stepping into therapy, right, that's when I started to notice like, oh, like I don't really know how to express my anger. I
mm,
don't know how to be confident in who I am, right? And I did an episode actually pretty recently with a woman who specializes in therapy for children of immigrants. And what really it has come down to for me, and like the thing that she and I really landed on, is that a lot of children of immigrants really struggle in trusting in ourselves because
mm.
our families of origins sort of create there's a community culture within our families of origin, like the community, the family, like the people, right? Like a group of people kind of decide what's right and wrong. And so if you go up against that and you disagree or you have a different point of view, the community is going to look at you and think there's something wrong with you or like call you out on it or whatever, right? Like it's really hard to have like an individual point of view and like feel different in that community. And so then oftentimes those opinions, those values sort of get like a mesh and like or really like pushed down. And so I think what I really have learned is that I have to have belief in myself to be able to really authentically live the life that I want to live, to be a cycle breaker, to build the family that I want to live. But like where that comes from is like shattering this idea that what I believe, what I think is right, what I want for myself is wrong, that it actually can be right. And that's at the core of, I think, the child of immigrant experience is knowing that like your voice, like what you believe, what your values are, that's important. That deserves space. That deserves like the fullness of everything inside of you. And we welcome safe, loving people to help us develop like what that will like become, like more of a shape that into what it is. But like our voice does matter and it has to matter in order for us to really like live a life where we feel like the fullness of who we are.
I think that's so powerful what you've just said there. And I love as well that you acknowledge that, yeah, okay, we welcome this safe, loving support, this safe, loving environment where other people can share their opinions with us and can do that in a way that is there to aid us, to support us, to better us, to help us be the people that we authentically are, as opposed to trying to squash that side of us and trying to say, okay, you are a bit different here and I'm not going to have that. I need you to fit in with the collective. It's a way of saying, oh, I see you as an individual. Have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about trying that? And I think that is such a vital difference. And often cycle breakers are portrayed as, well, it's my way or the highway. I know best. I know what I'm doing. I think I'm perfect at this. And that's a complete misconception. We still want that support. We still want that advice, those people to come in and lift us up as part of the village that everybody tells you you need to have. I think that's wonderful, but it has to be in a way that respects our autonomy and it has to be in a way that values us as people. And like you say, gives you that voice. I just want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier about growing up in an honor shame community. I
Mhm.
think that is really important to dig into that a little bit and talk about how that's impacted you as a cycle breaker and how that impacted your childhood and the things that you grew up with. Can you say a bit more on that for me?
Yeah, so I am no honor shame expert, so I'm gonna butcher the definition of this. Sorry to anyone who is an expert that is listening. You probably know better than me. I will talk about my authentic experience, right?
Yes,
There
yeah.
were so many. My default setting is shame. I just
Mm.
being totally honest with you. When I feel down on myself, I experience shame. I feel like I am not worthy, that I am not good enough. I notice, oh my gosh, like even like in this week, right? Like my son is learning or hasn't quite learned yet how to roll. And in my head, I started seeing myself being like, okay, are we doing enough? Are we doing enough practice? Like, am I doing enough to make sure he rolls? Like, am I like, these thoughts come up for me of like enoughness, worthiness, whatever, right? That's really what I'm saying when I talk about honor shame, because that's a culture that creates this idea that when you don't fit in, when you don't bring honor to the community, when you wreak the reputation or mess up the reputation of family, whether that be your parents or your grandparents or the community at large, right? That there is shame, right? The opposite of that honor is shame, disgrace. Like I think of, I don't know if you've ever watched like Mulan, but like
Yes. You're talking to a big Disney fan. There is not going to be much that I haven't watched that I'm not going to be like, I get it. Give me the analogy.
well, okay, my absolute favorite Disney movie is Mulan because actually I think Mulan does a pretty good job of depicting honor shame culture, right?
Mm.
This idea that like Mushu, I don't know if you remember these scenes where like Mushu would be like, dishonor on you, dishonor on your
Yes.
cow, dishonor.
I love Mushu.
like
Our cat was
the
called Mushu. Completely random fact here. This is probably my ADHD jumping in and being like, hello, random fact.
that's
My
a
cat
great
was
name.
called Mushu, and my son has loads of little Mushu things because she was my cat, but she was really his cat. Like he stole her. As soon as he
Yeah.
was born, he was like, that's my cat now. And that was Mushu. And we love Mushu. And I do remember that so clearly, that dishonor on you, dishonor on your family. It was dishonor everywhere.
Yeah, it's like if you do anything that goes against the grain, right? And I did a lot of things that like my parents didn't love. Like I moved away and like without like getting married. I did a lot of things that like kind of like rubbed them and like maybe potentially could have impacted like their standing in the community, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of this is like made up in their heads, right? Like nobody really cares. Like I think if there's anything that I could impart to another child of immigrant, like another child of immigrants, is this idea that like yes, everyone thinks that they are like the main character and like everyone cares about what they're doing, but like let me just be so straight with you that like most people don't really care. And even if you're like the news of the day for one day, 1 week later, nobody's going to care. And it is so much more important for you to do the thing that matters to you and like own the consequences of it. Let's be real. Like when you go against the grain, right? When you do things that make people uncomfortable, there are going to be consequences for that, but like own it, live it, do what you need to do to feel like authentically who you are, right? But like the idea, and I think the thing that prevents folks from doing this is that it's not just shame on you, it's shame on everybody. It's shame on all the people around. And I think that's where this like, oh my God, like just like I'm like shaking, like I you guys can't see this, but like, just like shaking my fists of like everybody who could get impacted by like the very small and benign things that you do on a day-to-day basis, right? And I think that's something that really impacted me throughout my life, and it's still my immediate reaction, or like where I really struggle in my own personal identity, is this idea of like, am I worthy? Am I worthy to do this? Have I done enough to do this? Have I been kind enough? Have I been fair enough? Have I, like I use enoughness and worthiness as like the thing that like I think is like probably both like it's probably my worst quality actually, is this feeling that like I'm just not enough. And that's not true. Like we as human beings all are worthy and enough as we are,
Mhm.
right? And there are always ways to like improve on ourselves, whatever. But like you alone in your body, in your shell, are worthy. And I think that's the journey that I'm on and will probably always be on, is a sense that I am worthy. I am enough. Whatever I choose to do, as long as it aligns to my values. And we go back to the safe people, right? I think I want to share a little bit about that. Like another thing for my white therapist, Joby, which is why I think if you are a child of immigrants or a person of color and are like, I don't care about what, like, this is white people shit. Look, I benefited from a white woman telling me straight to my, look, these things were not right. What happened to you was wrong. It doesn't matter if your parents loved you, they sacrificed, whatever. This shit was not right. And that was like piercing to me because she was not wrong. She was totally right. And like, you have to acknowledge, like, that's not a white, black, brown thing. That is just like a humanity thing, man. Like, some things that happen to us are wrong, and we need to grieve those things, and we need to acknowledge and like think about like what is the dynamic of what that's going to look like with our relationships. Like, we just have to decide, and like what Harriet decides as a white woman might be different from what you decide, but like it doesn't really matter. Like, we acknowledge what went wrong, we acknowledge the pain, we grieve the pain, and then we decide how we want to move forward. But Joby, my therapist, she told me like what you have to remember when you think about like safe people, right, is this idea that like you get to choose who the people who speak into your life are. Like, you choose. And most of the time you're going to choose somebody who is going to like love you, who loves you like unconditionally. Like, for me, like my husband, one of my best friends, Sue, like these are two people that like I know like love me unconditionally, and when they challenge me, they only challenge me because they deeply want me to be the best that I can be. Like, they love me so much that like that is all they want, right?
Yeah.
You notice that I didn't say my mom. Like, I know that my mom loves me, but like, does she challenge me in a way that like I feel is safe? Not all the time. And I think that's okay, right? Like, you have to really kind of do that inventory of like, who are the people in your life that are going to challenge you in a way that make you feel safe and secure, and know that you are not unworthy or unloved, or that they're not like mad at you for bringing those things up. They genuinely like love you and want the best for you. And when you're a person like me who struggles with like unworthiness, enoughness, like all of that, that can be really hard. Like, it can be really hard to people challenge you because like it immediately takes you to that shame place, right? Which is why now, many years of practicing this, right?
Yeah.
I know that I can hear things from other people, because everybody and their mother is going to have an opinion about you. Like, let's just be real. They're not going to like, I'm noticing in motherhood, oh my God, motherhood is full of people thinking all kinds of things about
Constantly.
you. Yeah, I was like, wow, like this is actually kind of crazy. Like, I didn't realize that like people were looking at me and my relationship with my son and have ideas about what that should look like, right? But
Mm.
like, I could hear those things and it can bother me for sure, right? But like, when people say those things, that person is not a safe person. So like, I can hear it. They are not safe. I can decide if it is valuable to me or not. And that
Yeah.
is like a skill that we have to build over time, right? But like, I think when you come from this shame background, right? When you hear things about yourself, like I didn't breastfeed, right? And so when people said things about me choosing not to breastfeed, right? Like, it almost like feels like this like massive behemoth like thing. Like, oh my God, like this is going to impact the generations to come. Like,
Yeah.
my son and his son and the sons of the future are all going to be impacted by this decision. But like, we all know that's not true.
We do, on a logical level, we all know it's not true, but at the time, like, I did not breastfeed my eldest, and I can confirm at 13 years old, absolutely nobody has asked me, did you breastfeed him? Absolutely nobody, no medical forms, nothing. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. And he doesn't care. It's not impacted him in a negative way. In fact, actually, my younger two children who were breastfed will be like, ooh, that's as much as I'm getting for my like years of trying to breastfeed and going through the pain of it and doing all the rest. Ooh, gross.
I know.
Like, guys, come
Honestly,
on.
shout out to the moms who breastfeed their kids. It is a difficult labor, I will say.
Oh
And
yeah,
also, I didn't breastfeed. I personally, like, I think you have to weigh those things, right? But like, there is a lot of shame around that, like,
there is.
genuinely. And like, honestly, like, I felt that shame, like when my child got sick, which he didn't get sick because he wasn't being breastfed. He got sick
Mm,
because he was surrounded by his cousins who are all like daycare kids. So like, they got sick. You know what I mean? Like,
yes, yeah.
that's
As they
normal.
do.
And
That's
like,
what happens.
as I do, that's what happens. And like, he was around other kids and he got sick, and they'll get sick again. Like, it is the reality, And so, but you can still feel shame,
Mm,
carrying this feeling that like, this is reflective of me, it's reflective of my family, it's reflective of my future family. Like that's a very heavy burden to bear.
Yeah. I relate so much to what you've said about that feeling of not enoughness and that feeling of shame and have I done enough here and constantly trying to feel more worthy. But I relate to that very much from the point of view of I was never enough for my mum and I was never enough for me and I was never enough for the people around me. But you have that added layer that you've been describing of having to carry the pressure of being worthy for the whole family, for the whole community, for your actions impacting. My mum may have said to me, this looks really bad for me if I'd have stepped out of line. But that was where the book stopped. It was, I look bad to your teachers, not I look bad to your teachers and my friends and the community, and now my standing might be affected. That's a whole other layer that's added on top of that experience that I have had. And I think anybody listening would relate to that feeling of shame. Shame is such a common part of growing up in a dysfunctional family unit. But that added layer, I think, is very specific to what you've been talking about.
Yeah. And I would say too, like when you're a child of immigrants and like your parents have come here, a lot of the times, like, we like hear this about the immigrant story, right? Like they came to give a brighter and better future for their children. And
Mm,
so when you mess up, when you do things that don't align to like this vision of what they thought, right? That can feel so terrible because you're like, but my parents sacrificed so much to give me this life to, like I joke that like my mom like wore shirts with holes in them. Like she's genuinely
mm,
proud of that because she's like, because I saved $20 so that my child could take like, test prep courses or like, go to a better prestigious university or whatever it might be. Right. And so when when you feel that way, and it's such a powerful tool of manipulation, let's be
yeah.
honest, right? Because then you're like, but like I don't mean that. Like just because like I want to like wear like a short skirt doesn't mean that I don't value
Yes. Yeah.
what you've done for me, right? And one of the things that I actively am like working through, right, is this idea of black and white thinking. And I think a lot of young people, especially like where I come from, like I realized like myself, my sister and I like grew up in this family system where like we both really, it's either really good or really bad. Like there is no gray. There is no gray. And I think that's like the journey is you can like want to wear the short skirt and you can also respect your parents. Like you can
Yeah.
want both. It's not a reflection of like you not loving them. Like I married a person my parents didn't necessarily like right off the jump. Did
Okay.
I not love my parents? No. I loved my parents. I actually thought I was doing everything right. But like I think like a lot of children of immigrants that I know, and like in my own experience, our parents' emotional maturity is really stunted. Like they don't have the skills to like emotionally communicate and like to process their own feelings. And so like things that are really that should be like talked through and processed and like navigate through, like that's a responsibility of adults, right?
Yeah.
I did that for my parents. I still do that for my parents. I know like for my dad, for example, like you can go from 0 to 100 real fast. Like I can't even begin to tell you how many times for something very small where I challenged him, it was like, you don't love me anymore. You want
Mm,
me to die. You like things like it goes from like 0 to 100 like super fast. And it's like that's like what like toddlers do,
yeah.
when they want something, right? But like if you think about it, like a lot of these older folks who have not really learned the skills of emotional regulation and like emotional maturity do things like that. And then we just think it's normal to like blow a fuse when you like lose your keys or whatever, right? Which like is a genuinely like when I lose things or when my partner loses things, like the feeling I have inside my body of like panic is so real because I experienced so much like trauma, like, anxiety, panic, like anger when I did that as a young person, that even now in my adult body, there's nobody getting mad at me for losing keys now. I carry that shame. I carry that in my body. And it's like crazy to think that like it has that much of an impact on me.
Yeah. And it's like the body remembers. The body
Yeah.
remembers those experiences that we had when we were younger. And like you said, you knew that doing these simple things like losing something would go from 0 to 100. It would become
Yeah.
such a huge thing. There would be anger, there would be shame, there would be panic, there would be, this blaming. And it would be such an overreaction is how we would see it now. But when you're dealing with parents who have that emotional immaturity, who don't know how to communicate, who have never been taught how to communicate, who've never had that modeled to them, and you have parents who weaponize their sacrifices, as they would put it, which in reality, I think most parents want better for their children. There's a difference between wanting better for your children and striving for better for your children, and then weaponizing that or feeling like you have a debt that needs to be paid to you for making those sacrifices.
Yeah. No, it's a really powerful manipulation tactic. And I think if I say that, someone would be like, oh, that's white woman shit.
Yeah.
No, it is literally a manipulation tactic. Like, call it what it is. Like, own it. Like, I know my mom manipulates me sometimes. Do I love my mom? 1,000%. Do I
Hmm.
know that she uses like all throughout my life, because my dad was very not emotionally regulated throughout my life. And even now, like my mom would always say like, well, your daddy is like that, like your daddy, like he doesn't know how to like communicate how he feels, like he loves you, but like sometimes he doesn't know how to express himself, like basically stuff like that, like he doesn't mean what he says. Because I do think for a lot of folks, right, there's also like language barrier, and that was a
Mm.
challenge for like me and my parents too, was that, you know, they don't understand the words that they're saying in English. So like they mean like they hurt more to you, right? Like I'll use an example. Like my son was sick for a few weeks, and my dad didn't mean to do this. Like I don't think he meant to do this at all. But you know, when you're sick, you don't look the happiest. So my
Mm.
son River didn't look super happy, or apparently to my dad. And so he was like, he doesn't look happy. He doesn't look happy. And I took that so personally.
Yeah.
He didn't mean for me to be, and I knew that truly, because like I've spent decades, right, like being my father's daughter, right? So I knew he didn't mean that, right? But I'm a parent now, and like the worst thing that you can hear your parents say to you is that or say to you about your child is that they are unhappy. That like broke my heart, to think that like my little son, who I spend all day taking care of, is not happy. That broke my heart. Like I know my dad didn't mean it the way he said it, but like he doesn't understand like how his words can like hurt me, you know? And so later I had a conversation with my mom about this, because my mom is sometimes the conduit between me and my dad, because if I said it directly to my dad, he would just like blow up on me, and then he'll be like, I don't
Mm.
want to talk to you guys. I don't want to see River. Like, what? Like, I don't want that. Like, I'm not ready to
Yeah.
face that. I'm just being totally honest. And we could talk a little bit about what it looks like to have a relationship with your immigrant parents in a second. But I I told my mom, I was like, look, I understand daddy. Like, I understand like what he was trying to say. Like, I think he was trying to say, like, I'm concerned, like he looks sick, like whatever, right? Like he doesn't have all of those words to say, right? But he wanted to say that, but he said this. And when he said that, it hurt my feelings. And
Yeah.
so like this is the like rupture and repair that we talk about, right? Like it hurt my feelings.
Mm.
And my mom's immediate reaction is like, daddy didn't mean it. Like, you American kids you're so sensitive. You think so much about all these things. Like, you need to not think like this about us. Like, you are crazy for thinking like this, whatever. All these things, right? And I was like, look, mom, like, you can tell me that, and like I'm an adult, and like I've lived like this in this cycle for so long that like, yeah, I accept that that's the reality. Like, I am a very well aware that this is the reality. But if you expect me to tell my son one day, when his grandfather accidentally, which will never be intentional, like if he unintentionally hurts my son, I am not going to explain to my child that it is okay for his grandfather to behave in that way. I will never do it. And I want to
Yeah.
tell you that now. Like River is going to have his own reactions to this behavior. And when he comes to me and asks me what my opinion is, I'm not going to be like, oh, that's your apacha or that's your grandfather.
Yeah.
You just have to like put up with it. I will never ever do that. And I told her right then and there, like, you know this now, like just know that this is what's going to happen, you know. But like I think that's the challenge for a lot of adult children of immigrants. Like we've just been like managed this way, right? Like a lot of the times it's been by our moms. Our moms are like the like pillars who like keep the families together, and like our moms have sort of like figured out how to deal with all of this brokenness, right? But like now you're a parent and now you don't want your child to think it's okay to like use certain words and like not to say sorry and like very basic things, right? And like you're going to have to figure out what that's going to look like, right? Like I want my child to have a relationship with his grandparents, but it is sort of figuring out like when is it the time to like express yourself, which like if I'll be totally honest with you, like my dad has said many things like that to me all throughout my life. I have never felt like more confident or more than I needed to say that until I had my son.
Yeah.
I was like, I have to say this now. Because if I don't say it now and like set the precedent now, when something happens, they're gonna be like, why didn't you defend us? And I'm gonna be like, I told you. I told you that I wouldn't defend you.
Mm.
Because like it is not my job to defend you. It is my job to defend my child, you know? And so I think that's like the rub though, is that if you've been like micromanaged like this, like all your life, like all my life, my mom was like, that's how he is. Like, say sorry, to keep the peace in the family. Like, do it for me, do it for the peace of the home, blah, blah, blah. All of these things that like you just kind of get used to like playing that role and doing that.
Yeah, and just accepting that this is the way this particular parent is, and you might have one parent who is very enabling of that, who
Yes.
allows that to continue, who doesn't challenge that, despite the fact that they can see that it hurts their own children. And there is a sense of betrayal with that parent, and looking at them then and saying, hang on a minute, why haven't you stood up for me in the way that I'm trying to stand up for my child? What were you thinking? And it's as you say, it's that wanting to keep the peace. And again, in your experience, it's that cultural norm of this is the way that things are. And it's passed down through generations that dad is allowed to behave this way. And he didn't mean it. So it doesn't matter when it does
Mhm.
matter. And actually, if he were to step back from the situation and see that what he'd said had hurt you because that wasn't the intention, if he could accept accountability for that, there we go, job done. It would be, it sounds so simplistic, but that's that rupture and repair. And what I find with these older parents is that they are unwilling to make the repair because that means actually being introspective and saying, hang on a minute, I've messed up here. Not you've messed up or, well, I've messed up, but it doesn't matter. I've messed up and I'm sorry, and that's hurt you. And I need to do better next time. And then actually putting the effort into changing that behavior. That's really difficult. And I know you mentioned that this is something that happens even now, this micromanaging, and that that's something that you're seeing in navigating that relationship that is somewhat distant, but also is still a relationship with your parents.
Yeah. I would say too, like, I have a lot of empathy for like the women of my community, of the Indian women that I know and like the aunties and whatever. I have a lot of empathy for them because a lot of the time that I have seen, this is not necessarily true of every community, but this is what I have seen, right? A lot of these women have no clue how to function without their spouses. And so, like, it would have been detrimental to them to like push back against their spouse, right? To like really challenge them. I think that like that is real. Like they didn't have access to resources. Like oftentimes, like their husbands controlled like the funds in their home. Like they wouldn't know how to do like very basic things. And so now as our parents are getting older and their spouses are, passing and like all of that, we're starting to see like the reality of that. Like that is something I personally experienced like with my husband's mother, like not knowing how to function without like their male partner. And so like I can see how this could be even more challenging because you just need to keep your family system stable
Yeah.
because like if it collapses, like what happens then? And
Mm.
when you're, and I think that's why I have a lot of deep respect for my mother, even though I know that she has many times been manipulative towards me. I
Yeah.
don't always think it was intentional, but I think it was for her own safety, her own security, right? Like if she allowed me or like, like enabled me to be as like feisty and like, go up against the grain, there could have been consequences to like the larger family structure,
Mm.
right? And so I have a lot of empathy for that because I know, like for my own mom, it would be really hard to navigate life without my dad. Like I know that, and so it is tough, and that's why I empathize with the plight of children of immigrants who like want to have relationships with their parents, who maybe want to maybe either have low contact or estrangement. Like it's very challenging because it's not just like your relationship with that parent, it's your relationship with the entire family system and how the entire family system suffers because of that.
Yeah. I think you could summarize pretty much so much of what we've said here with the two truths coexist, in that we
Yeah.
can have empathy for that experience and that their experience can have been really tough and that there can have been very valid reasons for why they did the things that they did, whilst also being detrimental to us, whilst also being hard for us to navigate. If there was one thing that you would want to say to another child of immigrants who is currently going through this realization that they don't want to pass down the same cycles, that they don't want to experience their parenthood the way their parents did, and they don't want their children to have a childhood that they did, what would you say to them?
I think what I have learned in my life, and especially in being a podcaster, is that we have to define the values of everything, the values of every aspect of our life. And so when I think about being a parent, when I think about being a spouse, when I think about being an adult in this world, like my job, my commitment to myself, all of these things have values. And when we look at our lives, I know for me, a lot of my values do not align with the values of my parents, and they don't sometimes align with like the values of like the family system I come from and like the larger community that I come from, right? And so that is what I really encourage children of immigrants to do, is figure out what your values are. There may be some alignment, and that's great, right? You have to decide, like, are your values important? Do they matter? Are you willing to like stand up for your values? Because at the end of the day, when I think about my better than fine life, when I think of like a life where I take up space, where I feel authentically myself, where I feel joy and peace every day, it's when I'm living in alignment to my values. And it is really hard to do that every day when you are surrounded by people who are misaligned to their values or to your values, right? And so I think that's the first step, is figuring out like what your values are, because once you know what they are, you'll start to very easily see where there is misalignment in the communities around you. And then the next step is deciding like how can then you create distance within that, right? And how do you find the right people? Because sometimes we might be spending our time in these family systems that just like are not serving us, that are not aligned to our values, and we might really need to like physically remove ourselves from those spaces, like physically, whether that be, moving to another place or even just like joining other community groups, right? Like all of your people are out there. That's all I have to say, right? But in doing so, it takes a lot of work. And I know that as an adult and like when we have our own families, like it is just like surviving every single day is hard,
Yeah,
difficult
it's
work.
tough.
It's tough as a parent. I have a recently graduated newborn to an infant, right? Like I understand. Like it is challenging. But like that work where then you're surrounded by people that align to most of your values, because like not every person is going to align with everything that you
Mhm.
value, right? Then you feel like this freedom and this peace and this ability to just like take up space. And like my biggest hope for anyone listening to this podcast is that you just fill up the room with space. Like you allow your immenseness to take up every space that you're in, right? Like we should not play small, we should not feel small, right? And oftentimes when you come from environments or family systems where like that is just what it's really easy to be small everywhere else in your life. And to me, that is not a life worth living.
Rachel, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I feel like this episode is going to be so powerful for so many people, and I love what you've just ended on there. Can you let people know where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on Spotify and Apple at the It's Fine podcast with Rachel Varkey. I'm also on Instagram at Rachel Varkey. And I am so honored to have this conversation with you, Harriet. It is so cool to see your work because a lot of people don't even know where to begin when it comes to navigating our relationships with our families, and just giving them the words, giving them the experiences and like shared experiences. It's one of the coolest things. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. And guys, thank you so much for listening. I will speak to you again next week. Bye.